This conference will now be recorded.
So, I can tell you that we know the market's really crazy right now. We know buyers are maybe doing some things that we don't think are such great ideas in order to get homes right now. And everyone's really been focused on how do we help buyers win houses, but we want to make sure that we're also doing our best to prove that we're helping buyers make the best decisions they can. And then also on the flip side, on listings, it's super important to know that yes, your listing's probably going to get multiple offers and sell on the first day, but when a buyer's putting down $15,000 or $20,000 of due diligence, you better believe they're combing over your listing information with a fine-tooth comb if they start to get cold feet. They're going to look for any way possible to argue that they should get that money back. So basically, the first thing I want to call out, coming soon listings. Coming soon listings have to be measured if you're going to put them in the MLS. Couple resources that are super easy for you to locate on the Real Estate Commission's website. If you just go up to the search bar and you type measure, you can find all of this. Everyone, if you are listing a home, you should probably take a look at the measuring guidelines. One of the things that I hate to see on a listing is listing to be professionally measured on this date. Because you know what the commission says, you have to measure a home or have it measured if you advertise the square footage. Well, if you've got a listing that says home to be professionally measured, you're admitting that you didn't measure it. You've got square footage in there, you've admitted you didn't measure it. So then the question becomes, well, where did that measurement come from? So that's one of the things that I hate to see in a listing. If I see it on one of our listings, typically I'll reach out to the listing agent and I'll go delete that verbiage from the listing because it's admitting that you didn't do your job. And super timely here, this is a regulatory affairs case study from just last month. So for those of you who don't know, Fred Moreno is one of the people who reviews, so you probably know the actual regulatory affairs people like Stephen Fussell. They review complaints and they decide whether or not it needs to actually be sent to the commission. So if the staff decides a case warrants a deeper look, they send it to an attorney like Fred Moreno. And if you actually have to go in for a settlement conference, you're going to be sitting in a room with an attorney like Fred. So, in this particular one, basically the listing agent didn't measure it, and they assumed because the home was in the middle of a city that it was connected to city sewer and water. And of course, you can easily find this, it's in the bulletin, but basically, the buyer was going to renovate the property. They went to add a bathroom, attempted to connect that new bathroom to this sewer line, and discovered that it was actually on a septic system, and that it was going to be over $14,000 to get it connected to city water at that point. So obviously the listing agent's in trouble here. They didn't measure, and I think it actually said in the listing the square footage is from the tax records. So now the thing for you to keep in mind here when you're representing buyers, the buyer agent was added as a respondent. So just because you're representing the buyer and you really, it's really tough to get a home right now, doesn't mean that you can disregard your normal duties to your buyer. So in this case, because it said square foot from tax records, the buyer's agent should have seen that as a red flag and realized that this home had not been measured. Now, I will say, you'll see down here, the case against the buyer's agent was closed with just a warning. So, you know, the buyer's agent didn't actually get any kind of serious discipline here, but they did get a warning from the commission, and that's something that goes in an agent's file. And if you were to get a complaint for that exact same issue again, they're not going to just give you a warning. So definitely something to keep an eye on is, and that would be the same thing. If you're a buyer's agent and you see a listing that says home to be professionally measured on a date that is not today, or a date that's in the future, that's a red flag to you that the home has not been measured. And so you need to discuss that with your buyer. Make sure you have somewhere in writing where you discuss with your buyer that, look, you know, that says in the MLS, this agent has not measured the home. You know, we don't know where the measurements came from, but there's a possibility they could be off. Because that's square footage is something that the commission will hold the buyer's agent for accountable for just as much as the listing agent. If it's substantially off, they expect you to catch that too. Any questions about, I mean, I know we're all supposed to know that, yeah, duh, obviously you have to measure every listing, but you'd be surprised how often people seem to think that coming soon is not the same as advertising for some reason. Or, you know, that because it's coming soon, they can go ahead and stick it in there and get it professionally measured later. But we all know the number of sight unseen offers that we're getting while listings are still incoming soon.
Aaron, if they did not measure, the listing agent didn't measure, and you're representing the buyer, do you just go to the listing agent and say, hey, this is your responsibility, or then is the buyer's agent truly responsible to measure the property?
So I would start by going to the listing agent and saying, hey, you know, just letting you know, I've discussed with my buyer, your listing says that you haven't measured it. If you feel like what's in the listing is pretty close, you could probably just get the appraisal, have the buyer, you know, order their appraisal early in the process to verify everything. If you suspect it's off by a substantial amount, you can go in and measure yourself. So yeah, that it just depends kind of, that's a case by case one there where, you know, if it says 1,500 square feet and you're like, yeah, that looks about right, you could probably go ahead, you know, still discuss it with the buyer that, hey, the listing agent admits in the listing they didn't measure it. So, you know, you could even, if you look up the tax records and it happens to be the exact same size, you could, you know, let them know, look, it looks like they just pulled this from a tax record. The tax records are notoriously inaccurate. So, you know, and a buyer may give you that written verification that, hey, you know what, we don't care if it's 1,400, we still want the house. But as long as you're making sure that you call it out to your buyer, that should help protect you in that kind of scenario.
Okay.
I would add there though, if you take on the responsibility of getting the home measured yourself, you're assuming liability if you actually do the measuring and you screw up. So you might want to consider charging your buyer to get an appraiser to measure the home if it ends up the listing agent won't measure it for you.
Well, yeah, definitely true. Yeah, if you measure it, then now you're responsible for your own measurements. So I would only do that if you're confident in your own measuring. The only home I've ever measured myself was an exact rectangle ranch. Anything more complicated than, you know.
Oh, I always pay an appraiser. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm ready to hand it off. So any questions about that one? Has anyone run into this as a buyer's agent? I can tell you, this was not even the height of the market. This has been probably 2 years ago now. We did have an agent who was representing a buyer, and the square footage had changed on the listing in the MLS. And it turns out what happened was the listing agent, who was a very well-known big agent, had gotten it measured by an appraiser, had put that square footage in the MLS, and then the seller came to them and said, hey, that square footage is not right. Here's an appraisal from 2 years ago that says it's a bigger size. And essentially, of course, our buyer got another appraisal done during the process, found out, yeah, it was you. Found out that, the listing agent, or that square footage didn't match what came back in our appraisal. Our appraisal was pretty darn close to the original measurement the listing agent had done. And once it went through the process, the listing agent was found liable by the commission. So yeah, this definitely, even if your seller complains, no one listing is worth risking your license for. So if a seller is really arguing with you that they think it should be bigger, then they need to pay for another appraisal right then, and you can compare. And now if those come back substantially different, you may want to go out and give it a shot yourself and see where things fall. But yeah, square footage is a big thing right now. And just the important thing to keep in mind, like I said, is yes, the home's going to sell on the first day and the buyers may not care, but buyers suddenly start caring a lot more when they put down $20,000 in non-refundable money and they find out the home's 100 square feet smaller than they thought. So same thing with the features. We've actually had 2 cases, situations that they're not actually commission cases yet, that they could easily become commission cases, where our buyers have gotten under contract, of course, putting down big due diligence fees, and found that the listing agent included features that they never verified were there. The listing agents come out and said on one of them, oh, I got it from the previous listing. So that's never, ever going to cut it. One of them was the listing claimed that there was a backup generator for the property. And upon inspection, the inspector said, yeah, there's not a backup generator. We found that adding a backup generator that would power the whole house would be a very expensive addition. So, that again, saying that you got it from the last listing is never, ever, ever going to cut it with the commission. That's going to be your theme here, is that listing selling easily is not an excuse not to do everything that you normally would for a listing. So Lana says, I had a buyer make an offer on a property. When I was running comps, I realized the seller's agent simply copied the house next door for features and measurements. Wow, that's even bolder. Yeah, copying the house next door is definitely even worse than copying the previous listing. The house was not the same as the one next door. At the time, I reported it through MLS data checker and never got a response. That is not probably an enforceable MLS rule. The MLS doesn't police. Well, they do to some degree, whether data is accurate. Things like, is it in the right zip code? Is it in the right county? It would probably depend on how big the feature was, but yeah, they definitely look into everything, but they're not going to reach back out to you. Just FYI, if you ever report something to the MLS data checker, they probably will check on it and talk to the listing agent, but it's not a kind of scenario where they're going to, report back to you and say, hey, we did this and they've, fixed it.
Yeah, I think in this situation, they would have emailed the listing agent and said, hey, an agent has reported that they believe that the square footage is incorrect on your property, and, check it. But they won't go back to the person that actually submitted it. Lana, did you happen to check to see if the measurement was changed later or not? Because if it was, that's probably what happened.
Yeah, it looks like she said it was early in her career, so I don't know if you still.
Yeah, so they changed some of the information. So yeah, I think what happened was TMS did get a hold of the agent and informed them they just won't follow back up with the person that submitted the request or the complaint.
Yeah, TMLS is actually quite diligent about those issues, and to be honest, their violations probably even have a little more teeth than commission complaints, because you don't fix it, it's $100 fine within just a couple days. So definitely, if you ever think there's inaccurate data in a listing, and the listing agent doesn't know who it is unless unless you make yourself known, call up the listing agent and say, hey, I'm going to file a complaint with the MLS because this is wrong. But yeah, the listing agent will never know who submitted an agent reported violation to the data checker. So don't feel bad about doing that. We're all held to the same standard. So but it's largely self-policed. So if you don't report it, they may not know. So yeah, and actually, so you see in the comment, Lucy is the one who ran into the listing agent who added a backup generator to the listing because it was
I am so much hungry. Okay. I don't know. I don't know if they're waiting to talk to me or not. So.
There we go. But yeah, so next thing, when it comes to listings, and so I realized there was some discussion about this in the Facebook group, and I emailed in-car legal about this, and unfortunately I didn't think about doing it in time to get a response before today. So these kind of addenda, waiving repairs and waiving the appraisal. When we are representing a seller, so first of all, let's take a look and see what this does. So the thing that bothers me with these is the buyer retains the right to perform due diligence. The buyer retains the right to terminate the contract for any reason or no reason at all during the due diligence. There's no additional penalty here if the buyer, so if the property doesn't appraise, or if the buyer finds that, hey, there's just a lot of repairs that we weren't expecting here. Nothing in here changes the original contract, essentially. So I think it's important when we're talking to sellers, these addenda might make a seller feel a little bit better about one offer over the other, but I would not let a seller believe that this kind of addendum actually means a buyer cannot terminate if they think there's too many repairs, or that if the appraisal comes in low, the buyer can't still terminate. And frankly, the buyer could ask for repairs and a price reduction anyway, because the original contract, Form 2T, it specifically says that it is an as-is contract and it's not contingent on financing in any way, which means it's also not contingent on appraisals. So now if you're representing a buyer and signing a form like this will put your buyer over the top, frankly, I don't see any risk in having a buyer sign it, because they're not giving up any of their due diligence rights. So their due diligence fee is non-refundable with or without this form. Earnest money is refundable until due diligence expires with or without this form. But I do think it's particularly important on listings that we not give our sellers the impression that this form guarantees a buyer is going to close no matter what. So, you know, if you like to use these with buyers, again, knock yourself out. But I don't want us to give our seller the wrong understanding of what this form does. Was someone trying to talk? Any thoughts or questions on using these forms? Are any of you, you know, using them extensively for your buyers?
Um, I have a
So,
question.
oh, go ahead.
So if the buyer signed this, could they, and the appraisal go down, go lower, can they go to the seller? Or like, if they sign this, they shouldn't, the seller give, does give the seller some insurance that they will not go ask for money as a price reduction. Am I correct?
In theory, but the thing is, when the buyer signs the original contract, if they sign a contract for a $300,000 house, they're already agreeing that they're willing to pay $300,000 for that house, regardless of what it appraises for. So it does say a buyer shall not request that the seller reduce the purchase price, but the buyer has the same due diligence rights as they do with the standard contract, right? They can say, you know, okay, it didn't appraise, we're going to terminate and walk away. So they've got the exact same leverage that they would have without the form. The buyer can say, you know, look, I know I signed that form, but we didn't think that the appraisal would come in 50,000 less.
Okay.
We've got to work on a price adjustment, or I'm going to walk away. In that discussion, honestly, now the seller may point to this form and say that they're not going to, and that's fine. But the seller could point to Form 2T and say, I'm not going to.
Okay. I had a listing agent once asked me to waive the appraisal on an email and said, if your offer wants to stand, put that in writing. I didn't use that form because I didn't know it exists, but we didn't win. But so if your buyer said it will not go back and ask for a price reduction, can you go back? After you still can go back, you're saying?
I mean, yeah, it's essentially that's the bottom line is, you know, now it may help a buyer kind of, you know, it may kind of help scare a buyer into feeling like they, you know, really are committed to it. And it's probably got more use as a, I guess as an attitude pre-adjustment for the buyer. You know, you've added this extra addenda that, you know, is stating up front they're not, I mean, of course, we know it's already in the contract. Unfortunately, neither the buyer or seller probably reads much of the contract except the blanks with money in it. So, you know, if they were really reading the original contract, they would possibly understand a little better that this is true anyway. But yeah, it can help set the tone for a transaction. But, you know, I would just, if you're a listing agent in particular, personally, I would find proof of funds. You know, I would find a bank statement with 100,000 in cash on it a lot more compelling than a buyer signing this form. You know, obviously that's really kind of up to you and your seller to judge the overall quality you feel you have with the buyer. But yeah, personally, proving that you've got the cash to me would be way more important than signing any particular addenda. Again, this is Yeah, so I think Michelle asked if this is a standard form. It's not. This was prepared by some attorney in Chapel Hill. I don't know him. I'm not vouching for this form. So if you are interested in that, I would reach out to your favorite closing attorney. Probably every closing attorney out there at this point has been asked to draft one. I mean, if they do any amount of closings, they've probably been approached by an agent to draft one and may have one that they've just, got sitting around they could send you. Let's see. So I've been using for buyers in multiple offer situations. You make a great point. Listing agents aren't telling their sellers that it really doesn't mean much. Also on listing side, a buyer signed this, but did indeed still ask for repairs and price concessions. So yeah, it definitely, it's more of a, I guess, a psychological thing, probably, that it feels like you're drawing that line in the sand. But yeah, like you just said, you had a buyer that signed it and then still asked for repair money. Seller something makes them feel less guilty about saying no. Right. So yeah, again, probably more of a psychological thing than an actual legally enforceable thing. But yeah, it can make the sellers feel better, more confident when they say no. A short appraisal last month in buyers. Fine. Helped them to it. Yeah, and I mean, basically, I think the gist of this is that you could have done that without the addenda or the email. Like I said, when they signed 2T, they're agreeing to pay $300,000, or whatever the price is. So, if this sort of addenda makes your seller feel better about it, there's no reason to refuse it. But I definitely think it's important to emphasize to our sellers that this doesn't mean that they won't still come back and ask for a price reduction or repairs later. Because, one thing you'll see that's missing in here, there's no limit. This basically says that they'll make up the difference. But suppose it appraised 100,000 less, would they still make up the difference? So there's definitely, it just says they won't ask for a price reduction. It doesn't say that, it doesn't set any limits on, we'll bring cash, but only if it's up to 50,000. And, there's nothing like that in here. So just be cautious when you're representing sellers that you don't lead them to believe this guarantees a buyer will close. Because I think it could be easy for a seller to misinterpret it that way. Any other thoughts on that one? A lot of emails with the verbiage right now because it's a weekend. Yeah, attorneys aren't open, and sometimes, and really that's kind of one of the things we really want to get to in this is that you shouldn't be getting too creative. We understand it's hard to get homes for your buyers, but you need to make sure you're protecting yourself. You as an agent typing up an email saying your buyer has told you they will do this is fine. It's not going to be very enforceable. But you want to make sure that you don't somehow cross the line into, attempting to draft some unofficial addenda to the contract. So we'll move on to talking some about the buyer side. So I'll tell you that the original impetus for this meeting is actually John Henderson. Some of you may know him. He recently became the district director for our new Goldsboro, Wayne County office. And he actually called me up and he's like, hey, I'm really worried about, liability for buyer's agents when, a buyer puts in an offer that we know is 25 or 30 or 40,000 more than that home's really worth. What can we do to protect ourselves in that case? What happens when a buyer comes, a homeowner, now maybe a seller, comes back in 4 years and finds that they have no equity, that now they're short selling because they overpaid up front. So I can tell you, as buyer's agents, number one, of course, we know the buyer ultimately decides what they're going to offer. You do need to be honest with them about what is required to purchase a home right now. There's no value in letting them offer a $250 due diligence fee and 10% under list price, unless you legitimately think that's going to get it. But one of the best things you can do as a buyer's agent is prepare a CMA. If you're worried that your buyer is overpaying for a home, again, that's their choice. They can choose to overpay for a home, but if you want to protect yourself down the road, prepare a CMA. If they want to offer $350 and they don't care that they're overpaying, great. Do a CMA showing that the home you think is worth $325. Have them sign it, stick it in the file, because that's, our job is to give them advice, but not make decisions for them. So if they were to come back down the road and say they file a complaint with the commission claiming that you coerced them into buying this home, you tricked them into paying too much for this home. And believe me, there are buyers who will do that. When they find out that they're going to net nothing or going to have to bring money to the table because they are selling even 2 or 3 years from now, if the interest rate bumps up a point, we may not be seeing this kind of seller's market, and they get relocated for their job and find out that they're going to lose $15,000 when they sell because they overpaid for it now. Buyers will absolutely be coming back and accusing their buyer's agents of tricking them or deceiving them or coercing them into buying that home. If you've got a copy of a CMA and you had your client sign it and you stuck it in your file, you send that right on back to the commission, and you're going to have proof that you gave your buyer good advice, and then the buyer, submitted that crazy offer anyway. So that was actually where, sort of the idea for this meeting came up is, how do we protect buyer's agents from, buyers who unfairly, suggest that our agent did something wrong down the road. Because you think it sounds far out there, but it definitely happens. We've got one buyer who just closed who already before closing was telling our agent that, she coerced her or pressured her. She felt forced to make an offer on this house. It's new construction. No, and of course it was ridiculous. Our agent had an email sent to that buyer where she said, here's the 3 homes in the market that fit your criteria. Let me know what you think. And of course the buyer picked the one that she ended up closing on, but not before making a huge deal about how she felt like our agent had pressured her into going under contract on that home. So, it's not hypothetical. There's already buyers out there starting to say things like that. So just keep that in mind, especially if, now new construction, that's one thing. That's, new construction is just, you pay what the builder asked for. You could still do a CMA on it if you feel like a neighborhood is just not in line with the comps around it. But particularly on resale, when you've got buyers offering, these 5-figure due diligence fees and paying well over list price, it would be a really good idea to have a CMA on that home that you could stick in their file, because we will definitely see some of this coming back in a few years. And then the other thing, the professional services disclosure and election form. I had an agent recently who, okay, is an email. An email showing you sent it to the buyer is definitely, that would be good. Yeah. I mean, anything you can do to prove that you provided it is going to help protect you. If you can get them to initial it, that'd be kind of the gold standard. But yeah, if you got an email showing that you sent it to them, or even a response from them confirming that they received it, anything like that's going to help you if that type of issue comes up for you. So then, any more questions then about that CMA? Sorry, I didn't ask before I moved on to this one. Okay, so professional services disclosure and election form. Now, of course, all of you know that we require this on all our transactions at Fathom. I recently had an agent try to request an exemption for it. And the reason given was, well, the buyer or the client waived all those services. They didn't use anything. Well, okay, that is literally when it is most important to use this form. So I know some people will say, use this form as sort of like a menu to help you keep track of what your client's using, what they're not. But honestly, having a client, especially a buyer right now, waive any services they're not going to get done, that's probably even more important than getting them to select the ones they do. If your buyer is waiving an inspection, maybe they're a cash buyer and they're waiving the appraisal, it is critical that you get this form filled out and that you update it. If they change their mind, if they start out saying, oh, we would never buy a home without an inspection, and then they find themselves in the throes of a bidding war and they say, you know what, never mind, we'll waive the inspection, we love this house. If you'd already had that discussion with them and you filled it out saying that they were, going to get a home inspection, if they then change their mind during the process, it is absolutely critical that you come back and amend this form. You should really, as you're approaching the end of the due diligence period, even if you got this filled out at the beginning, you should really come back, just go over this form with them one more time and make sure they got everything done that they wanted to get done. And if they ended up, maybe at the start of contract, they said that they wanted to get, a radon test, but then after spending $20,000 on due diligence, they decided they don't want to pay any more cash out of pocket. They decided not to get one. Be sure you come back and amend this form. Like, having a buyer waive a service is the best protection you can give yourself. This form does more to protect you as an agent than just about any other form we use. That's why we require it on every form. So yeah, absolutely. I would recommend it when DD expiration is approaching. That's when you really want to double check and make sure that your buyer's gotten a chance to do everything they wanted to do. Like I said, especially now when they're, they've got so much money on the line. And if something's changed, just be sure you come back and amend this form. We have had concrete examples in the past of agents who had clients come back 1-2 years later, and they said, you know what, this turned up on the house, you didn't tell me I could get an inspection. Well, luckily the agent had filled out this form correctly. They were able to come back and show, well, actually, this is your initial, you waived your home inspection. You knew that you could get one and you chose to waive it. 100%, this is some of the best protection you can provide yourself as an agent. And honestly, we do require this on the seller side. I realize that really the only service they have to get is an attorney. But again, in highly competitive situations where buyers may be looking for any possible way out of a transaction if they decide they're unhappy, again, think about these sight unseen offers. They put down $10,000 of due diligence on a house they've never seen. Well, when they walk in that house and realize they don't quite like the color of the paint in one of the bedrooms, they're going to look for an excuse to get the $10,000 back. So, a seller always has the right to hire their own attorney to do the deed prep and lien waiver. Now, when you run into that situation where the buyer suddenly is talking to an attorney, which we all know means the closing attorney, they're getting advice from the closing attorney because the closing attorney works for them. They don't work for the seller. But if your seller chose to hire their own attorney to do the deed prep and lien waiver, they would have an attorney who's probably not going to spend a lot of time with them because they're only paying maybe $200, $250. But they do have an attorney that is working for them. The seller is that attorney's client at that point. They're not just doing paperwork on behalf of them without an attorney-client relationship. So a seller can always get their own attorney. And now, not that I want us to end up like the state of New York, but in New York, both sides have their own attorney every time, every transaction. But particularly when some transactions can get a little contentious right now, it may be more important than usual for a seller to feel like they've got their own attorney that they could call with questions. So what is the right way to fill this out for a seller? Well, so basically our recommendation is just to waive it. If they don't need it, have them waive it. Don't put NA, don't put not applicable. There are other things on here that a seller could choose to do. Y'all may not agree on the price of the home and they want to get an appraisal done to help arrive at the list price. They may want to offer a home warranty. They could even pre-inspect the home. If you've got a seller who knows what the market's like and, doesn't want to run into issues where, hey, we collected a $15,000 due diligence fee, their inspection found some major issues, and suddenly, you've got people talking about giving the due diligence feedback, refunding, all our costs, things like that. They could choose to have the home inspected up front and share that with buyers so that they don't run into those issues later. And yeah, I mean, I get it. A seller doesn't need to get a mortgage, but just have them waive it. So that's what we're looking for there is, don't put an A, don't, skip blanks. Just go ahead and have them waive anything that they're not getting done. Any other questions on that one? The elevation certificate is it's related to whatever. I don't know the flood insurance program, the National Flood Insurance Program, exactly what it does, but I think the elevation certificate is somehow related to whether or not it qualifies for that. And I believe a lender orders those. If every once in a while, I will look up the answer to this, and then it comes up so rarely that I forget it again later. So if anyone knows off the top of my head, or off the top of your head, I'm pretty sure that's something that a lender is going to order if there's a lender.
Yeah, Aaron, that's the flood certificate that the lender orders just to verify the house isn't in a floodplain. I don't know why they decided to add a second line here for flood. I guess if the flood certification comes back yes, then you have to indicate who's responsible for ordering the flood insurance that'll be required, which would be the buyer. Typically, you're not going to do it as a buyer agent, but yeah, that's what the certificate is.
So, and do you know, is that something that we could access on our own without I assume.
Well, so if if it's a lender involved, the lender's going to order it. They're doing it. If it's a cash sale, there are ways that I've seen it online where the buyer could just order one for themselves, just so they would know for sure if it's in a floodplain or not. If you just Google it, you can find companies that do that stuff.
Okay, cool. All right, well, we've got about 10 minutes before our hour is up. We've hit all the major issues that I had on my list this morning. Do y'all have anything in particular that maybe has been concerning you within your own transactions that you'd like to sort of throw out there, get some advice on, get some opinions? And just so you know, you can unmute yourself. You can mute and unmute yourself. If you'd like to ask a question, don't feel like you have to scramble to type it in. Just hit your microphone and talk.
Hey, I have a question about the love letters. I know we love discussing this, but so if my buyer wants to write one, do I have to tell them what they can and can't put in it, or do I just let them do it and then pass it on and the listing agent decides what to do with it?
So, I think it would be a good idea to let them know. I mean, they've probably heard the term fair housing, but they may not know what it means. It'd probably be a good idea to maybe send them some sort of fair housing information and just say, look, this is a federal law. You really need to be careful. I can't tell you exactly what to put in there and what not to. But I think there's also, you talk about our duties to our clients. We have a duty to follow their lawful instructions. I think there would be a case to be made that if they give you a letter that's just really over the line, fair housing violations, I think there would be a case to be made that you are not obligated to send that to the listing agent. I think if you are a listing agent and you get one that has obvious fair housing violations, again, that one's a little trickier. I would say there's a case to be made there that you're not obligated to present that to your seller. But I think if you're the listing agent and you get it, probably the safer bet is to present it to them. But again, give them the fair housing information and say, look, this letter's got, these are obvious fair housing violations. You should not make your decision based on this information. But yeah, there's a little gray area. If I'm not mistaken, someone just posted that in our group this morning.
Yeah, Aaron, I'll jump in here for a second. I had John Waite, one of the in-car attorneys, did a presentation a couple of months ago, and this was one of the topics we talked about. So his opinion, the real risk for love letters is on the seller side, because I mean, technically a buyer can try to entice someone to break federal fair housing laws and give them a house, because the federal fair housing is you cannot discriminate on selling a house. There's nothing about discriminating on buying a house. So the real risk is on the seller side. So as a buyer agent, I think you should educate your buyers on the law, but there's really very little risk on the buyer side to passing along a love letter that may violate federal fair housing. Although I think he said it would be safer for the buyer agent to point out to the buyer, hey, the seller cannot use this to determine if they want to sell you the house. He also said on the listing side, yes, the listing agent can get into trouble if their seller uses that letter to persuade them to sell this house, and it's based on a federal fair housing issue. So he recommended what you said. Yes, as a listing agent, you do need to pass it along to your seller, but you need to tell them, hey, this violates federal fair housing. These are some things. You just educate them, in other words, and document that. So if they do choose to ignore that and violate federal fair housing as a listing agent, you've shown that you educated them and you told them not to do it, but they still chose to do it. And the
I like
danger,
that idea of, I like that idea of, I'll find some link that's kind of quick and easy so I can say, hey, if you want to write it, just try to avoid anything that touches on these things, and talk more about how well qualified you are and you've been at your job for, any of those things that would make a seller feel good without stepping into worrisome zones.
Yes, right. Any other thoughts on that one, or any other scenario you've run into out there that's making you feel nervous?
you want to talk about escalation clauses?
Sure. Let me, 'cause I've got that Q&A, I believe, saved. So this one, so it's actually, they've covered this more than once. Although I think the previous Q&A was probably back in, I don't know, more like 2016. So they recently put out an updated one. So it's definitely, I think at the end of the day, what you need to know is it's got to be something that an attorney drafts. So there's also the issue of disclosing another buyer's offer. And one second, I'm going to look something up real quick, because I actually asked for a definitive answer from the Real Estate Commission on this relatively recently. Let me see if I can find it here.
So I was told by someone else that had talked to the Real Estate Commission that they got an answer from the Chief Information Officer, was that basically it was, quote, impossible for a listing agent to comply with a escalation offer.
Yes, and that is exactly what they told me. And I was going to see if I could actually show it to you in writing from the commission. Can't remember when I asked them that though. Oh, there it is. So yeah, that is same thing I got back from them. That's the final truth. A licensee cannot disclose terms of any other buyer's offer without permission from that buyer. Thus, it is impossible for licensees to participate in negotiations regarding escalation clauses that require such disclosure. So that is a definitive answer from the Real Estate Commission. If you are the listing agent, you cannot disclose the terms of the offer that triggered the escalation clause. So yeah, that is going, it makes it impossible to comply with some of those contracts. So I think if you get an offer from a buyer that has an escalation clause that requires that disclosure, I think you just have to tell that buyer's agent, the Real Estate Commission has said definitively that we cannot disclose that I cannot disclose that information to you. Now, honestly, at that point, I don't quite know where that leaves you, because I suppose there would be an argument for that buyer to make that the seller is in breach if they sign that addendum and then don't disclose that information. So I think, if you do find yourself in that situation, you need to have a conversation with your seller, and probably what I would suggest is send a memo to the buyer with that escalation clause, and say the seller would favorably consider the following terms. have them submit a new contract without the escalation clause. I think, you know, they may still say that they want to see the offer that triggered it, and you have to tell them, I cannot give you that. And if that causes them to rescind their offer, well, you know you've got another offer because, of course, you, being a totally above board and ethical Fathom agent, would never fabricate a competing offer to trigger their escalation clause. So you know they're going to have another offer on the table that's pretty close to that one anyway. So Kathy's question was, if the buyer's escalation addendum does not specifically say that proof is required, the listing agent does not have to worry about it. Right, correct. Yep, if the escalation clause does not specify that you have to provide that proof, then yeah, you're okay.
Well, yeah, but the only gray point about that is if you, before you're under contract, if you go back and say, well, here's the price, you have effectively told them what the highest offer was, the highest other offer was. So it has to be done in a way, like Aaron said, where you basically send memo and say, here's what my seller will take, without actually referring to the escalation clause and just get them to submit a new offer. So you have, folks, this is at your own risk. I mean, I had an attorney, the in-car attorney, the same one I mentioned earlier, who talked about this, and he was saying, here's some things that he thinks might work, but he had a big disclaimer. If you go in front of the real estate commission, they could easily rule against you no matter what you do in the scenario. So it's at your own risk.
Yeah, and that's, you know, I always caution people, you know, the real estate commission always says, we're not out to get you. But if there is a complaint against you, they are out to get you. They will comb through your file and look for everything you potentially did wrong. So just, you know, the case that we looked at the beginning regarding the home that wasn't measured and whatever, it's supposed to be connected to city water and sewer. So you saw, if you read that, the complaint was not against the buyer's agent. The buyer's agent was not originally part of the complaint, but when they started looking into the case, the buyer's agent was added as a respondent. So yes, you know, once the commission gets a hold of a file, they will look for anything that you did wrong and they will hold you responsible. And they don't make exceptions to the rules. So yeah, that best case probably is just to use a memo to buyer. If they submit an escalation clause and it turned, you know, and your seller wants to accept that one, I would recommend sending a memo to buyer that, you know, does not reference any other offer and say they would favorably consider these terms. And in fact, if there's an escalation clause in play, you know, honestly, you could send that memo to buyer to both the offers, because, you know, if it's been triggered, we know that there is another offer. You could send that memo to both buyers and, you know, see who wants to submit that offer. Clarify, to protect our sellers, when there's an escalation clause involved, we should always have the buyer's agent. So, well, see, that's the tricky part with this. We're not really protecting the sellers here. Seller, this is a real estate commission rule, which means we as the licensed broker can get in trouble. Unfortunately, this is one of those scenarios where the seller could probably do whatever they want here. I don't know quite how that might come into play, but because license law, yeah, because this is just a commission rule. So we can't provide that. So we're really protecting ourselves here rather than our seller. But yes, my best recommendation would be send the memo to buyer, give them a number, say if you submit, you know, the seller will whatever favorably consider an offer at these terms. And and I would specify to the buyer's agent when you send that, you know, the seller, you know, you and the seller would prefer to see an offer without the escalation clause. So, and then VK asked, how does it work for the buyer? Well, the buyer's not, the buyer and the buyer's agent. I mean, I don't know if there's any potential that the commission could say you as the buyer's agent somehow participated in the disclosure of another buyer's offer without their written consent. Like I said, again, the commission can get pretty deep into exploring how many people they think are at fault when it comes to their own rules. So, I would just say that's on the buyer side. I think there's less risk to you for sure, but I would not want to tell you that there's no risk. Okay, well, we are just a little past 11 here. If you've got any more questions about the escalation clauses, we will try and tackle those. Otherwise, we will probably be wrapping up here. All right, I'm not seeing anything. Lucy just asked if people use escalation clauses. Frankly, I don't know that I've reviewed a transaction in our office that included one. If I have, it's been no more than a very small handful and not so many that it stood out to me. So I suspect they are not as common as the number of questions we get about them might lead people to believe. We don't have any handout. I did record this. So yes, I'll have the recording available. It takes GoToMeeting a little while to transcribe it and have it actually available. If you don't see this by the end of the day tomorrow, post in the event again and ask about it to remind me, and I'll get it put up there. All right, we're going ahead and